they were both doing with their heads was some kind of malcontent. Pineda leaned over and clapped the two humans on the back. He made an unusual double-handed, cross-armed wave at the lorch, then he turned to Alden to shake his hand. Congratulations. It's exciting to see a boy your age joining the medical team. Hope I'll get to work with you next year. These guys will make sure you have a good experience. Thanks, Alden said, shaking his hand awkwardly with the arm that was holding both goggles and lab coat. I would love that. Oh God, he thought. I'm taking your job, and I'm probably not even qualified, and your friends look like they want to beat my ass for it. Pineda was being cool about it, but he had to be cool. What was he going to do? Pitch a fit? At best, he'd be blacklisted by the university, and never get summoned for this gig again. And Batikwal clearly did not care that half the people in the room just looked either sad or pissed off. Alden didn't know if she had bad social skills, or if she just had no reason to pay attention to the atmosphere among the Artonan's servants. Even worse, she gestured at the seat Pineda had just vacated, clearly indicating Alden should take it. There were plenty of empty seats in the room, ones not surrounded by people who were shooting him death glares. He stared longingly up at the Grivix as he squeezed down the aisle toward Pineda's chair. He could sit with the giant panthers, or they could eat him. Either way, he'd be out of his misery. Instead, he sat down awkwardly between the stocky guy who was breathing hard and staring at Batikwal's retreating back with murder eyes, and the other man who was wearing a full three-piece suit and an expression like he'd just watched his own father being kidnapped. Whispers went around the room when Batikwal was out of sight, and Alden did his best to feign an avid interest in his cup of Wevi. He kept sipping it, ignoring the fact that it was burning his tongue, in hopes that his orientation meeting would start and he wouldn't have to talk until he'd gotten his bearings. He stuck out like a sore thumb. The other human avowed were all much older than him. The next youngest was a pair of women who looked like they were in their mid or to late 20s, and everyone was well dressed. A few, like the man in the suit, had gone with business wear from Earth, but most were in muted Earth tone outfits that had a distinctly Artonan feel to them. A few people had accessories he thought were magical pieces, but the only person wearing a recognizable set of gear was a woman around 50 he'd noticed when he entered. She had on the black tunic and pants he'd bought himself from the wardrobe, the set for housekeeping. And then there was Alden, wearing the jeans and t-shirt he'd fallen unconscious in hours ago and carrying the lab coat. He really hoped Batikwal made good on that promised necessities package, and that she considered clean underwear a necessity, or it was going to be a rough couple of weeks. What talents do you have? Asked the guy looking to Alden's right. We thought she was only replacing that Tmethan who panicked after hearing who was in charge of labs this year, but you must be getting double work? He had an Nesidoran accent. I have a preservation skill. The guy frowned. I guess that makes sense if it works on people. Pineda specializes in safely slowing bodily processes. He's a healer? Great. Batikwal replaced an actual healer with me. A D-rank one, he put everything he had into being useful for emergency medicine. That was interesting. Except for rare S-ranks, healers couldn't just instantly fix people. Many of their skills were long, and their skills were taxing, so someone who could make an urgent case slightly less so for them was always going to be valuable. Wonder how my skill would mesh with that. Not as well as Pineda's, probably. Another avowed wouldn't be able to heal the person he was preserving while he was using the skill. Would be better for transporting people to a healer than helping when one was readily available. What's your class? The angry one demanded. Alden tried to smile politely. Rabbit. It should have been obvious based on the fact he'd been flash summoned for this, but maybe it wasn't. Fucking pet, the man spat. Wow. Fortunately, before anyone else could share their opinion or ask him questions, a group of university faculty appeared to restart the interrupted orientation meeting. Kind of weird how I've been on 2 different college campuses in as many days for reasons that have nothing to do with my education. It was also weird how much the first speaker, who was just there to welcome them all and impress upon them the value of their service, sounded like the dean who'd spoken at Hannah's funeral. Nice, but in a way that made you think they'd had their personality sucked out and replaced by a bunch of politically savvy greeting cards. There wasn't anything of substance in that speech, but the next speaker, who worked for the Office of Admissions, seemed to be trying to make up for it by cramming an entire rule and etiquette manual into 10 minutes. It was all really obvious stuff, Alden assumed, but maybe some of the advice was relevant to certain species and not others. He couldn't imagine any of his fellow humans scent-marking university property. The only things of real interest he learned was that they weren't allowed to associate with the incoming students outside their scheduled examinations, and that they were allowed to use a number of very cool campus facilities in the evenings, and that they would have an enforced sleep schedule appropriate to their individual needs. They would literally be given knockout drugs and ordered to take them at a set time if they weren't already sleeping. Apparently this was standard. Nobody but him seemed to find it unsettling. The rulebook would be available to them through their interface at any time, and any infraction would result in a lifetime ban from the university and its affiliated institutions. Judging by the uncomfortable looks and the creaking of chairs as people shifted in their seats, this bothered them all much more than the sleep requirements. Afterward, they broke into small groups, depending on where they would be working. Alden couldn't meet with the medical team and the lab team simultaneously. He was relieved when an Artonan professor with so many tattoos he looked like a living circuit board waved him over and insistently and took the decision from him. The lab group looked less stressful anyway. He and one of the Grivics seemed to be the only assistants. The professor was abnormally tall and lanky for an Artonan, and the dramatic impact of his full wizard's garb was marred by the fact that he'd stuffed all the pockets with food from the breakfast. Something that looked like an oversized churro was staining his pants with grease. Instead of a tablet to help him interact with the system, this man had a lens over one eye that seemed to serve the same purpose. He flicked his fingers, and the eye with the lens darted rapidly back and forth, completely independent of its neighbor. "Alden, my darling rabbit," he said in flawless English. "So happy we'll be working together. What a nice skill you have. You're my savior. You must let me give you my business card. Don't bother with a name on it. You may call me Joe." Before he'd even finished, his business card appeared in the form of a message notification, and when Alden opened it, he discovered Joe had sent over what looked like his entire CV, plus playlists of his favorite songs, categorized by activity. His real name was Superior Professor Worley Rodin, which sounded nothing at all like Joe, no matter how Alden tried to pronounce it. "He's uneven," Alden noted. It wasn't as much as the Velras had been, but it was noticeable. Meanwhile, Joe was telling the Grivic to call him something that sounded like a death scream. The Grivic repeated it as a high-pitched yowl that made Alden's spine crawl. "I'm so happy to meet you both. Alden, sweetheart, I see you bought my coat." He pointed at the lab coat. "I was on the committee that decided it should be included in the wardrobe decades ago. It hasn't been nearly as popular as I imagined it would be. Clearly, we were meant for each other." Alden didn't know how to answer. He wasn't sure how much of the professor's behavior was a joke. He was now complimenting the panther alien on the color of its helmet, so maybe it was all just an attempt to be friendly. "Alden, dear, our companion here says I may give her a human name for the sake of your limitations. I think you should call her Sophie, and she can call you can't she? I'm afraid she's really not much to overlap between English and Grivecry." Sure," said Alden. This whole conversation felt like something out of a dream already, so why not? "Nice to meet you, Sophie." "I am pleased to slaughter problems with you," Sophie shrieked, nodding her helmet. Joe sighed. "If only we could slaughter the examinees and devote our time and talents to more interesting pursuits. Alas, my parole won't allow it. Come, our lab awaits." As they left, Alden glanced over his shoulder at the woman in charge of the medical team, trying to catch her eye. Shouldn't they schedule a different time to talk? But she was deep in conversation with her group, and she never even looked his way. Well, maybe it's not necessary. If there was an emergency, all he could really do was pick up an injured person and carry them in the direction someone told him to. He'd taken a first aid elective in middle school, but he doubted that would come in handy. Did CPR even work on Artonans? Professor Joe led him and the Grivic to the basement, and then through a series of dimly lit hallways to a stark white room the size of a football field. There were 75 large lab tables set up, covered in identical sets of equipment. Most of it was utterly unfamiliar. All Alden recognized were burners, beakers, scales, and tongs, and even those were oddly designed. "Let's see," said Joe, cracking his knuckles and narrowing his eyes at the tables. "Yes, it's the same crap setup they used to have. How do they expect to inspire and stimulate the youth with this kind of hand-holding? I don't know. Do you see those irradiators? So many safety features that there's no room for student creativity." He was pointing to a line of large ovens at the back of the room. "Come this way, Alden," he said. "We have to fix it." "Should I target you?" Alden asked. "With my skill?" Oh, no, not at the moment. Though you can if you like. Actually, I'm very interested in that skill, my dear savior. That particular limited edition gem is perfect for lab work, but not so for this lab work. The The obsessed honor student from the personnel program is so focused on minimizing costs that she's crammed you in because you'll be adequate at 2 different jobs, rather than ideal for either one of them. Very stressful for your first assignment, I would think. Oh, said Alden. He was simultaneously worried that he was going to fail hard, and relieved that someone in a position of authority seemed to be aware that Petitqual didn't care much about his suitability for the assignments she'd given him. Why is my skill bad for what we're doing here? Excellent question. It's the entrustment. Your ability to hold volatile reactions instantaneously and completely is dreamy. I wish I could do it myself. But the fact that someone will have to willingly give the dangerous substance over to you is a complication for today's job. I thought I would mostly be hauling away trash. How dull. There will be a bit of that, but you and our angelic Sophie here are going to prevent terrible catastrophes from killing off the aspirants. Isn't that exciting? I've done this before. I'm usually in charge of monitoring students at the irradiators. And so you shall be today, unless Alden and I make a mistake, and then it will be your job to throw yourself on the grenade, so to speak. Alden stared at Sophie in alarm, but the Grivik was making a choking sound that his interface said was laughter, so that was good. Now, Alden, it's best of you to think of the students as revolting, arrogant little pukes who can't hold the idea of their own failure in their head for even a moment, the professor said. Especially the ones in the first 6 sessions. They're all trying to test out of the introductory courses. Ha! As if I'd let them. Joe crouched down beside the nearest lab table and opened something that looked like a mini fridge. It was full of bottles, jars, and pouches that contained powders, liquids, and shavings of wood and metal. A few even had whole dead animals inside them. I will do my best to strike fear into their hearts when they first arrive, to impress upon them the importance of giving you their heinous failures when they're told to. However, we mustn't expect them to be entirely rational. This is the sort of school that attracts a lot of, shall we say, coddled geniuses. He started taking things out of the fridges and tossing them toward Alden, who had to drop the lab coat to play catch. He was soon holding an armful of what he assumed were chemicals and magical reagents. Take those to that corner over there, Joe said, flipping his hand. Let's make sure our students have an exciting educational opportunity. Alden did, and on the way back to the next station he donned the lab coat and grabbed a large metal bin. It looked enough like a trash can for him to be fairly confident that was its purpose, and he wanted to reduce the number of thrown objects if possible. He set it next to Joe, who was clearly in an entirely different set of ingredients out of the next mini-fridge. How do you score an exam when everyone has different supplies? Alden wondered. You look gorgeous, Joe said, beaming at the lab coat while he stuffed things in the bin. Even though he'd said it wasn't necessary, Alden went ahead and targeted the professor. He seemed like the kind of person it was best to be over-prepared for. Joe had given Sophie an assignment of her own. The panther-like alien was going from table to table, carefully rearranging some of the equipment with her claws. So, said Alden, what am I supposed to do if they're not rational? The students. What do I do if they won't give me their heinous failures? This is where it's a bit inconvenient. If they won't behave, and you can't make them behave, then I shall have to do it myself. Alden wasn't sure how he was supposed to make an Artonan holding a volatile object follow his instructions. Don't look so concerned. We'll work it out together, Joe said brightly. We'll think of the first session as a trial, and then over lunch, assuming we haven't been brought before the disciplinary committee, we can discuss opportunities for improvement. Alden was still pondering that worrying statement, and the fact that the professor seemed to actually mean it, an hour later, when the woman in charge of the medical team hurried into the room to brief him on his role in the event of an emergency. You're basically equipment, she said bluntly. No thinking required. If you get called, just use your skill to the best of your ability and follow instructions from anyone with more authority than you, which is everyone. She gave him a red glow stick to wear around his neck at all times, and 4 different pills that he should take immediately after an emergency teleport to reduce undesirable outcomes. What does that mean? Alden was already feeling strange about the fact that he'd be forced to go to sleep every night. Getting casually drugged left and right hadn't been a feature of any story he'd ever heard about being avowed. This one keeps you from throwing up, this one keeps you from passing out, this one temporarily inoculates you against theted fever, and this last one makes you unable to register physical pain. There is no way this combo is good for my health, especially the one that offered immunity to pain. If that was available on Earth and not dangerous, people would be taking it all the time. He thanked the woman anyway and stuffed the pill bottle into his pocket, hoping he wouldn't have to use it. The initial group of examinees arrived around 2 hours after Alden had first set foot in the lab. He and Sophie sat on the floor in the back by the irradiators, watching as each one entered the room and bowed to Professor Joe, apologizing for the fact that they had to wear shoes while working with dangerous supplies. Every prospective student was accompanied by one or two assistants who didn't bother apologizing for their footwear.
It is unnecessary for them,
Sophie told Alden in her quietest shriek.
They are of the non-wizarding class, so there is no assumption they will learn from the instructor.
Roughly 20% of Artonans used magic. The 80% of the species who were members of the second class couldn't even hold political office or vote. Based on what he'd seen of the faculty, Alden had assumed that the school was for the ruling class only, and this more or less confirmed his suspicions. "We outranked them, right?" he whispered. He knew it was true, but it felt strange enough that he couldn't resist gasping.
"Naturally," said Sophie. "A servant with power is more valuable than one without it."
Alden kept telling himself that just because a way of life was alien didn't mean it was wrong. But it still bothered him when he accidentally met the eyes of one of the assistants, and the man gave a nervous half-bow, as if afraid he might have offended Alden. To Alden's surprise, the examination actually began with a lesson. Joe walked the length of the huge room slowly, talking over their assignment and explaining what they were expected to produce. Frustratingly, the system didn't translate a single part of the lecture, not even when Alden quietly asked it to. He had taken the Artonan language intensive and the logograms course, but it was only a beginning. He was good enough to pronounce and understand his word chains and order off menus, but this lecture was about theoretical magic stuff, and he had almost no idea what the professor was saying. He caught every dozenth word and tried to piece something reasonable together out of it. Joe peppered his speech with a lot of reference to anatomy, which at first made Alden think the students might be creating medical potions or devices of some kind, but he gradually came to the conclusion that the anatomical stuff was actually really dirty swearing. The prospective students and their helpers kept blushing and gasping too much for it to be anything else. "Do you understand what they're going to be doing?" he asked Sophie as quietly as he could. Instead of answering aloud, the Griffix sent him a texting invitation. She could obviously control her interface mentally. "In past sessions, the humans have been asked to produce their own summoning assistive devices for one of the tests they will have later. This professor is unknown to me. He seems to be asking for a higher level of device than usual." Alden air-typed some more questions. Sophie had been working this event for 3 of her planet's years, which was more like 7 of Earth's. Joe really hadn't been joking when he said her job was to throw herself on grenades. Classes were categorized differently for Grivix, but based on her explanation, Alden thought she had both heightened speed and extreme regenerative capabilities. The latter wasn't something you really saw with humans, so he was pretty jealous. Purely out of curiosity, he asked about her rank, and when the system failed to translate the word she said, she gave a click of annoyance and tapped one of her feet 4 times against the floor. 4? Alden asked. She confirmed it with 4 more taps. But what does that mean? 4, as in 3 above the hyperbole rank on Earth, seemed unlikely. It would make Sophie a titanic existence by Alden's reckoning, and she seemed pretty normal for that. He guessed it might be 4 above the bottom rung for Grivix, which would make her a B rank like him, if the systems were equivalent. Before he could ask more questions, the translation subtitles suddenly turned themselves on for the end of Joe's lecture. "In the back of the room you will see my 2 dear assistants. Our Griffic helper will monitor the lab and report any instances of cheating. She will also guard the irradiators and serve as our protector in the event of a catastrophic accident. Our human assistant in the elegant red coat will come to your table to remove dangerous items as I deem it necessary. If you do not promptly and graciously give him your little mistakes, I will come and get them myself so I can shove them up your—" "It's really stupid that you cut out the good part there," Alden informed the system. "I think the Earth version of you wouldn't be such a prude." It ignored him, of course. Within a few minutes, the practical portion of the lab exam was underway. Alden could practically taste the stress in the air. One of the guys at the table nearest him seemed to be hyperventilating while he stared at the equipment. At the next table over, a girl was hammering on a sheet of copper-colored metal so hard that she looked like she was trying to pound it right through the table. Smoke was popping up at some of the tables, and at others the students were directing their assistants to dissect things. A few people were definitely muttering word chains while they worked. Alden had no idea what it might look like if something went wrong, but almost as soon as the students got started, he gained a new visual display that gave everyone in the room a very pale pink aura. Joe had told him to expect a danger detector, but this was better than he'd thought it would be. As the professor strolled the lab, noting likely problems, the aura around a given student would turn brighter. Hot pink meant Alden needed to be near that table, ready to take whatever disaster they made away from them. Hood up and goggles on, he walked around the room, repositioning himself as the auras changed, trying not to make it too obvious which of the nearby tables he was there to monitor. Joe was surprisingly intent on the students' work, and he actually adjusted the auras a lot, so Alden was getting more of a workout than he'd expected. A glimmer of dangerously bright pink appeared in his peripheral vision, which he was pleased to note seemed a bit wider than it had been prior to his affixation, and he hurried across the room to a table where a guy was pouring something that looked like boiling mercury into a tall metal cylinder. Joe wasn't even looking in his direction, so Alden wasn't sure how he knew there was a problem. The professor was 12 tables away, critically watching over a girl who seemed to be peacefully doing macrame with strips of skin she'd taken from the dissected animals. Just a few yards away from Alden, the cylinder made a loud popping sound, and its creator's aura went hot pink. Alden stepped right up to the end of the table and took his hands out of his pockets so that he'd be ready to grab the thing, and the guy gave him a frantic look. The cylinder popped a few more times, and then with a high whine, something like steam started to pour from the top. "Take that, Alden," Joe said calmly. The guy who'd spent the past 40 minutes building the cylinder reached for it as if to protect it, but it was too late. Alden had been expecting interference, so he'd snatched the device the second Joe had finished speaking. Walking quickly away from the table with the now silent cylinder in his hands, he felt slightly accomplished and tired. The drain from the cylinder was bad. It was worse than either the flame or the frog had been. It was even worse than Jeremy's punch, though he'd been braced for it, so at least he didn't stagger around the lab. Is it because magic is involved, or does it have to do with the potency of the reaction itself? He had no idea, but he did know he couldn't hold on to this thing for more than a few minutes. He was already saying, don't drop it, in his head to keep himself focused. He hurried toward a teleportation alcove in the corner. The door opened automatically for him, and he set the cylinder inside, leaping back and holding his breath so that he wouldn't inhale any of the strange steam in the couple of seconds that elapsed before the thing was zapped away. The drained feeling didn't last. As soon as the device was out of his hands, it disappeared. Alden checked his palms, feeling a little paranoid that he might have gotten some dangerous substance on himself, but he didn't think the skill worked like that. Even though he could feel the items he carried, he'd realized after holding the cup of Revi that Petiqual had given him that he wasn't necessarily touching them in the usual sense of the word. There had been a drop of liquid on the outside of the cup that he'd registered as wet, but when he passed the cup to the other hand, the water droplet was undisturbed, and his fingers were completely dry. His current theory was that the tactile sense he had from the items was actually part of the skill itself, a magical effect that made it easier for him to hold and manipulate them in a familiar way. He scanned around the room again, looking for the color he decided to call danger pink, but the worst he saw was a dark blush. Joe was verbally annihilating Cylinder Guy. Once again, the system was refusing to offer a translation. But this time Alden got the gist of it from context and the hand gestures the professor was making. Cylinder Guy was in big trouble for trying to interfere with Alden's theft of his project. Well, it would have been a problem. Just based on the experiments he had done with Jubbo and Jeremy, entrustment had a lot to do with possession. The cylinder setting untouched on the table belonged to nobody, as far as the skill was concerned, so Joe could entrust it to Alden from across the room. But if the student had grabbed it first, he would have been in possession of it, and he would have had to be targeted and give it to Alden himself. Targeting was no trouble. Alden could do it in less than a second by pointing or speaking. But that didn't matter, Cylinder Guy refused to hand over his toy. Alden guessed he could have made the student drop the thing and then had Joe entrust it to him, but dropping potential bombs seemed like the opposite of what they were going for. The student left the laboratory weeping, his future at the school apparently ruined before it had even begun, and Alden tried to look as unmenacing as possible as he paced back and forth near the person with the dark blush aura. It didn't work. The students at the 3 nearest tables were staring at him like he was the Grim Reaper. Didn't expect disposing of dangerous materials to make me so unpopular. He blinked in surprise as a notification flashed. Quest assignment. Assist Superior Professor Worley Rodin in Lab 7. Time to summons 5 hours, 43 minutes, 55 seconds. Note from Summoner. My lab is so much better than this one. You can just walk if you prefer not to be teleported. Don't worry about dinner. I'll feed you. Alden glanced over at Joe. The professor was patting his food-stuffed pockets, which was the opposite of appealing, but at least whatever he wanted Alden to do couldn't take too long. They'd run afoul of the mandatory sleep requirement if it did. How many quests can I even have at once? He'd been under the impression that you got summoned for one thing and then did the thing and then went back home. Was he even earning credit toward his refusals with all these extra jobs? Alden smiled and waved at Joe, which seemed to make the guy happy. Maybe he just wants to show off at Slab. Maybe it's not a quest to help him out with something incredibly crazy or dangerous he just thought of after seeing my skill in action. Alden stole a couple more projects from students who were too terrified to try to stop him, and sent them to whatever dumping ground was on the other end of the teleportation alcove. But for the most part, the first lab session passed uneventfully. Joe invited me to his lab tonight, he told Sophie while they cleaned up the tables after everyone left. Well, ordered me. It was a quest, so it wasn't really an invitation.
I'll mourn your passing, the Grivix said.
You have a very human sense of humor, you know.
She shrieked at him. Take it back!
I won't. I'm an honest person. I speak only truth. She flung a strip of skin at him. It was one of the ones the macrame girl had left behind. It bounced off his lab coat, and he stuck its tongue out at Sophie.
You should be careful.
Of Joe? She adjusted one of the scales with a surprisingly delicate touch.
He's a collector of contracts. You can tell if you know how to read his tattoos. It can be valuable to work with such people, but it can also be very hard.
You mean private contracts? Alden said slowly.
Yes, you are new. Don't sell yourself too easily.
I don't plan to sell myself at all. I want to work mostly on Earth, not be permanently attached to someone here.
Then you should be even more careful, the Grivik advised. His offer will be good. He would not have made so many contracts if he were not generous in some noteworthy way. Know your mind before you make your choices.